Waiter insulted Elon Musk in a luxury restaurant. But when he discovered the truth, you won't. They say never judge a book by its cover. But what happens when a seasoned server at a Michelin-starred restaurant in San Francisco sizes up a casually dressed patron and decides he's definitely not worth his time? What happens when those cutting remarks, sharp as a freshly honed chef's knife, land squarely on the ears of one of the most influential, and let's be honest, richest figures in the world? You might think it's a recipe for absolute disaster, a career-ending, headline-making catastrophe, and it very nearly was. So close. The hushed reverence of La Toile, usually a symphony of soft murmurs and the gentle clinking of silverware, held a different kind of energy tonight. A palpable tension, thick as the cream in their signature bisque, simmered beneath the surface. Rain, a persistent San Francisco companion, painted the panoramic windows with shimmering streaks, blurring the city lights into an abstract masterpiece. Inside, Julian Frost, a server whose cynicism had been polished to a fine sheen over a decade navigating the gilded cages of the city's elite, observed a lone figure entering. The man was utterly unremarkable, dressed in a faded charcoal sweater that had seen better days and dark jeans that suggested comfort over couture. He looked more like he was heading to a late-night coding session than indulging in a multi-course meal at one of the city's most prestigious establishments. Julian's lips tightened imperceptibly. Another one, he thought, a familiar wave of disdain washing over him, trying to play the understated billionaire. Please. His own name tag, a small silver rectangle, felt like a brand of servitude. The hostess, a vision of practiced grace named Annalise, whose smile could charm a viper, led the man to a secluded table near the back. Julian, strategically positioned near the service station, intercepted Annalise's barely perceptible eye roll, a silent, shared commentary on the guest's distinctly un-La Toile attire. He allowed himself a small, internal smirk. Annalise, bless her perfectly sculpted cheekbones, could deliver a withering critique with a single glance. Table for one, Annalise announced, her voice losing a noticeable degree of its usual, honeyed warmth. The man simply nodded, his gaze sweeping across the room, not with arrogance, but with a quiet, almost unsettling level of observation. It was a gaze that seemed to absorb everything, yet reveal nothing. Julian's evening had begun on a sour note. His ancient motorcycle, his prized possession and only reliable form of transport, had decided rush hour was the perfect moment for an unscheduled mechanical meltdown. The greasy invoice for the emergency repair sat heavy in his wallet, a stark reminder of his precarious financial reality. Tonight's tips weren't just welcome. They were a necessity. In this particular specimen, radiating an aura of comfortable mediocrity, didn't exactly scream black card baller. As he meticulously polished a Riedel wine glass, his movements sharper than necessary, Julian eavesdropped on the low hum of his colleague's commentary. Did you clock the guy Annalise just dumped in Siberia? That was Damien, the overly enthusiastic sommelier, whose French accent thickened noticeably when discussing expensive vintages. Looks like he's lost on his way to a Star Trek convention. Serafina, a statuesque waitress with a wardrobe that likely cost more than Julian's motorcycle, pre-repair of course, chimed in, her perfectly manicured hand adjusting a stray strand of her auburn hair. Seriously, that sweater is giving me programmer who hasn't seen sunlight in a week vibes. Julian suppressed a sigh. Table 12. His domain for the next hour or two, it seemed. Just his rotten luck to draw the short straw. He approached the table, pasting on a smile that felt as genuine as a politician's promise. The man was engrossed in his phone, his brow furrowed in a way that suggested he was either solving a complex equation or dealing with a particularly aggressive strain of Candy Crush. Julian cleared his throat, a polite but firm auditory nudge. Good evening, sir. I'm Julian, and I'll be your server this evening. May I offer you something to begin with? The man looked up, and Julian was struck by the intensity of his blue eyes. They held a sharpness, an intelligence that didn't quite align with the unassuming facade. Just still water, please. His voice was calm, measured, with a hint of something Julian couldn't quite place. Perhaps weariness? Julian poured the water, the crystal glass catching the dim light. A flicker of impatience pricked at him. Water. Initoile? Groundbreaking. Certainly, he said, his tone just a tad too brisk. Have you had a chance to peruse our menu? He gestured towards the hefty leather-bound book, its gold lettering gleaming under the soft lighting. The man glanced at the menu, his thumb flicking through the pages with a cursory disinterest. Not yet, he murmured, his attention already drifting back to his phone, which buzzed with insistent notifications. Julian noticed a headline flash across the screen, something about a new rocket prototype. Probably some elaborate fantasy football league, Julian scoffed internally. Julian stood there for an awkward beat, the silence punctuated by the delicate tinkling of a champagne flute from a nearby table where a meticulously groomed couple, dripping in the unmistakable sheen of old money, were engaged in a theatrical display of affection. Perhaps, Julian began, unable to completely mask the condescending lilt in his voice. You prefer something a little less challenging? Our onion soup is quite comforting. He lingered on the word challenging, letting it hang in the air like a delicate, yet pointed, insult. The man finally lowered his phone, his gaze meeting Julian's directly. There was no flash of anger, no hint of offense in those blue depths. Instead, there was that same unnerving scrutiny, as if he were dissecting Julian's motivations with a surgeon's precision. What do you recommend, Julian? He asked, the use of his name adding an unexpected layer of intimacy to the exchange. Julian's carefully constructed composure faltered for a millisecond. This wasn't following the script. He was supposed to be the one dictating the terms of this interaction, the arbiter of taste and sophistication. This guy was subtly wresting back control. Well, Julian said, recovering quickly, his voice regaining its practiced condescension, our Dover sole is exquisite. Pan-seared to perfection, with a delicate lemon beurre blanc. Although, he added, his eyes flicking down to the man's unremarkable attire, it might be an acquired taste for some. He let the unspoken implication, someone like you, hang heavy in the air. Across the room, Serafina stifled a giggle behind a perfectly manicured hand, her eyes sparkling with amusement. Damien, mid-pour of a Chateau Margaux for a notoriously demanding regular, shot Julian an almost imperceptible nod of approval. The man at table 12 remained unfazed. He simply raised a single eyebrow, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement that somehow managed to convey a world of amusement and understanding. And if my taste buds are feeling unacquainted with Dover sole, Julian allowed himself a small, internal victory. He had him on the ropes now. Then, sir, he said, his voice dripping with mock concern, perhaps we could interest you in our burger. It's a very approachable option. He delivered the line with the practiced air of someone tossing scraps to the less fortunate. Another notification flashed across the man's phone, something about a tweet going viral. He dismissed it with a flick of his wrist, his attention seemingly more focused on Julian's performance. He was starting to find an odd, almost perverse enjoyment in this interaction. The sheer audacity of this server was remarkable in its own way. It had been an AG since anyone had treated him with such blatant disregard, such casual disdain. The suffocating politeness of his everyday existence was, frankly, exhausting. All right, Julian, the man said, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips, a smile that held no warmth, only a detached amusement. Surprise-moi. Bring me what you genuinely believe is the best thing on your menu. Forget about what you think someone with my questionable fashion sense should order. Julian blinked. This was unexpected. He had anticipated offense, perhaps even a quiet request for another server. But it was almost a challenge. He forced a tight, professional smile. Very good, sir. He retreated to the kitchen, a low murmur of incredulity rumbling in his chest. What is with this guy? He muttered under his breath, grabbing a pre-printed order slip. Having fun with the tourist, Julian? Serafina purred, appearing at his elbow, with a tray laden with delicate amuse-bouches. Tourist? Please, Julian scoffed, scribbling on the ticket. More like someone who raided a lost and found. Maybe he's testing you, Damien offered, swirling a glass of wine under his nose with exaggerated care. See if you can upsell him despite his rustic charm. Julian snorted. I'll upsell him all right. Straight to the dishwashing station if he tries to stiff me. He returned to table 12 with a flourish, presenting a plate of seared foie gras with fig jam and brioche, the most decadent, and incidentally, the most expensive appetizer on the menu. He placed it before the man with a theatrical air, a silent dare. "Our pan-seared foie gras, sir," he announced, his voice laced with a hint of triumph. A delicacy that truly appreciates a refined palate. He allowed his gaze to linger on the man's plain, almost utilitarian watch. The man raised an eyebrow, but this time there was a genuine flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "Interesting. What makes a palate refined, Julian?" Julian allowed himself a smug smile. "Well, sir, it's about appreciating the nuances, the complexities, the sheer artistry of the ingredients. It's something one cultivates over time." He emphasized the cultivates with a pointed glance at the man's unpretentious demeanor. The man chuckled softly, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the quiet space around their table. "Fair enough." He picked up his fork, examining the foie gras with a thoughtful expression. "You know, Julian, it's been a while since someone's been so forthcoming with their opinions." Julian's smugness wavered slightly. Forthcoming? Was that a veiled insult? He couldn't quite decipher the man's tone. The evening progressed in a bizarre tango of veiled insults and disconcertingly calm responses. Julian suggested the most extravagantly priced wines, subtly scoffing when the man requested a simple Pinot Noir. He made a pointed remark about the man's choice of bread, suggesting a more appropriate pairing for his chosen dish, only to be met with a polite but firm, "I'm quite happy with this, thank you." With each interaction, Julian's initial arrogance began to fray around the edges, replaced by a growing sense of bewilderment. This guy wasn't reacting the way the entitled clientele of Latoile usually reacted. He wasn't getting huffy, wasn't demanding to speak to the manager. He was absorbing it all like a sponge, almost like he expected this kind of treatment. As the man finished his main course, a perfectly cooked, dry-aged ribeye, ordered medium with a casual wave of his hand, Julian approached with the dessert trolley, its tiers laden with sugary temptations. "And for dessert, sir?" he asked, his tone now carefully neutral, the earlier condescension replaced by a hesitant curiosity. He couldn't quite shake the feeling that he was missing something, that there was more to this unassuming patron than met the eye. The man looked up, a flicker of something akin to amusement in his blue gaze. "Just a check, Julian. I have a rocket to launch in the morning." Julian's eyebrows shot up involuntarily. A rocket to launch? Was this guy for real? He stifled a snort. Right. And he was dating a Martian princess. He forced a polite smile. "Certainly, sir." He retreated to the till, a strange mix of relief and lingering unease swirling within him. The weirdest, most unsettling service of his career was finally drawing to a close. He printed the bill, the total a breathtaking sum that made his own meager bank balance weep. He approached table 12, his heart doing a strange little flutter kick in his chest. This was it, the final act. Would Mr. Rocket Launcher actually be able to cover this astronomical tab? He placed the bill on the table, his gaze laser-focused on the man's hands as he reached for his wallet. A simple, black leather wallet, worn smooth with age. He extracted a card. Black, as expected. But this wasn't just any black card. Julian had seen those before, flashed carelessly by oil tycoons and tech moguls. This one seemed to hum with a different kind of power. The edges were sleek, almost impossibly thin. The surface had a subtle carbon fiber weave, a jolt of recognition, sharp and sudden as an electric shock, ripped through Julian. He'd seen that card before, in magazines, in whispered conversations among his colleagues, the kind of card that opened doors to entire countries. His eyes snapped up to the man's face, really seeing him for the first time. The intense, intelligent gaze, the slight, almost imperceptible smirk that now seemed less amused and more knowing. The faint, almost imperceptible air of someone who was used to being in charge. Recognition hit Julian with the force of a runaway train. His carefully constructed facade of cynicism shattered into a million pieces. His mouth went utterly dry. His hands began to tremble, the pristine white tablecloth suddenly seeming miles away. "Is there an issue, Julian?" the man asked, his voice still calm, but now laced with a distinct undercurrent of something unmistakable authority. Julian swallowed hard, his throat feeling like sandpaper. Mr. Musk?" he croaked, the name feeling foreign and impossibly heavy on his tongue. A slow, deliberate smile spread across Elon Musk's face. "Finally, Julian, for a fleeting moment there, I considered offering to pay in Dogecoin." The blood drained from Julian's face. He could practically feel the collective gaze of Damien, Serafina, and Annalise boring into his back. Annalise, her legendary composure finally cracked, stood rigidly by the reservation desk, her knuckles white as she gripped the polished wood. "Mr. Musk," Julian stammered, his voice barely above a whisper, his mind a chaotic whirlwind of every condescending remark, every dismissive gesture, every subtle insult he directed at this man. I am beyond mortified. I had absolutely no idea." "No," Musk said, his gaze unwavering, almost clinical. "You didn't. You saw a gray sweater and jeans and made a series of assumptions. You decided that because someone didn't fit your preconceived notion of wealthy, they weren't worthy of your best service." He paused, his blue eyes sharp as laser beams. "You judged the rocket by its remarkably unassuming launch pad, Julian." Julian felt a fresh wave of nausea churn in his stomach. His career, his carefully cultivated reputation, the prospect of those desperately needed tips, all dissolving before his eyes like sugar in hot coffee. He was about to be fired, publicly shamed, possibly facing a lawsuit that would leave him selling his prized motorcycle for scrap. I am profoundly sorry, Mr. Musk," Julian choked out, the words feeling hollow and utterly inadequate. "My behavior was inexcusable. Truly." Musk leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Inexcusable, perhaps, but also remarkably honest. He picked up his water glass, the ice clinking softly in the sudden silence. "In my world, Julian, genuine honesty is a rare commodity. Everyone has an agenda. Everyone is trying to sell me something. You, on the other hand, treated me with refreshing candor." Julian's heart hammered against his ribs. This wasn't the fiery condemnation he'd anticipated. It was something else, something almost perplexing. "Mr. Musk, I completely understand if you wish to have me terminated," Julian said, his voice barely a thread of sound, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I wouldn't blame you in the slightest." Musk chuckled softly, a low rumble that held no mirth. "Terminated? Why would I eliminate the only data point I've received tonight that hasn't been filtered through layers of sycophancy and forced pleasantries?" Julian stared at him, utterly bewildered. He felt like he'd stepped into an alternate reality. "Think about it, Julian," Musk continued, gesturing vaguely around the opulent dining room. "Everyone here is playing a role. The wealthy couple ostentatiously displaying their affluence. The sommelier theatrically decanting a vintage Cabernet. You yourself performing the role of the jaded but impeccable server." He fixed Julian with an intense stare. You, however, for a brief but illuminating period, dropped the pretense. "You offered me a glimpse into how someone like me, someone who dares to wear a sweater to a fancy restaurant, is perceived by someone like you." Across the room, Damien, Serafina, and even Annalise were openly gaping, their carefully constructed professional facades completely abandoned. "But I was rude, sir," Julian stammered, his mind still struggling to grasp the bizarre turn of events. "I was actively unpleasant." "Precisely," Musk said, a hint of a smile finally gracing his lips, a smile that held genuine amusement. "And that, Julian, is something I can't engineer in a focus group. Authenticity, even when it's served with a side of thinly veiled contempt." He paused, his gaze piercing. "Tell me, Julian, what truly motivated your discourteous service tonight?" Julian's mind raced. He thought of the motorcycle repair bill, the years of feeling invisible, of being treated as a glorified servant by people he secretly considered far less intelligent than himself. He thought of the simmering resentment that had become a constant companion. "Honestly, sir," Julian admitted, the words feeling strangely liberating after a decade of carefully curated politeness. I made a snap judgment, based on your clothes, and I was having a rotten day. He cringed inwardly at the lameness of the excuse. Musk nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. A remarkably human response, Julian, and a valuable lesson. For both of us. He reached into his pocket and retrieved his phone. I recorded a few snippets of our conversation this evening. Julian's stomach plummeted. Recorded? His every snide remark, every condescending tone, immortalized on Elon Musk's phone? This was a nightmare. Relax, Julian, Musk said, sensing his immediate panic. Not for punitive reasons, but as a reminder that sometimes the most insightful feedback comes from the most unexpected and initially hostile sources. He stood up, adjusting his unremarkable sweater. Think about it. I'm constantly surrounded by people telling me how brilliant I am, how revolutionary my ideas are. Someone willing to tell me, even implicitly, that I look like I don't belong in a fancy restaurant. That's a perspective I rarely encounter. He extended his hand. Thank you for the unforgettable service, Julian. Julian stared at the outstretched hand, his mind still struggling to process the sheer absurdity of the situation. He shook it, the grip surprisingly firm. Mr. Musk, Serafina interjected, her voice trembling slightly, her usual confidence noticeably absent. Please, allow us to offer you a complimentary dessert. Our soufflé is legendary. Musk smiled, a genuine, warm smile this time. Perhaps another time. Tonight. I think I've acquired a sufficient amount of food for thought. He turned to leave, then paused at the door, his gaze sweeping back to Julian. And Julian? Next time you see someone who doesn't quite fit your preconceived notions, try engaging with them. You might discover you were wrong. And you might just learn something valuable. He was gone, leaving a profound, almost surreal silence in his wake. Damien, Serafina, and Annalise remained frozen, their mouths agape. Julian stood there, the astronomical bill still clutched in his trembling hand, the weight of his monumental misjudgment, and the utterly bizarre twist of fate settling heavily upon him. He had judged Elon Musk based on his appearance and had expected to face the consequences. Instead, his unintentional honesty, his utterly unprofessional candor, had intrigued him. Later, walking home under the now clear San Francisco sky, the rain having finally relented, Julian replayed the evening's events in his mind. He pondered Musk's unexpected reaction, his strange appreciation for brutal honesty, and the profound lesson he'd inadvertently stumbled upon. He realized how close he'd come to professional suicide, how his own bitterness and cynicism had nearly cost him everything. The message, delivered not through a condescending lecture, but through a deeply unsettling and ultimately life-altering experience, resonated with a newfound clarity. Genuine honesty, even when uncomfortable or delivered with less than perfect tact, can unlock the most unexpected opportunities. Sometimes, the very qualities we perceive as flaws can become our greatest assets. And the man in the unassuming sweater? He served as a potent reminder that true value often lies beneath the surface, hidden from those who judge by appearances alone. Humility in judgment and respect for every individual, regardless of their outward presentation, are not just virtues, but essential cornerstones of understanding. Julian knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would never again mistake a plain cover for an empty book.